And I'm quite curious about the psychology of some of these historical figures and maybe even their moral psychology. And maybe we can start with Alexander the Great. But before I ask about his psychology, what were the general circumstances that led to his conquering Thebes?
Well, first of all, they thought he had been assassinated, or they thought that he would not win the contest to be, because he had several stepbrothers and uncles, so they weren't sure who was in charge. And then it's about 300 miles from Macedon to Thebes. So when they revolted and killed or imprisoned the Theban, the Macedonian peacekeeping force or contingent guards, they were ecstatic, and they thought everybody was going to break out. And so they sent word, and the Spartans said yes, the Arcadians said yes, the Athenians said, we'll help you. And before they knew it, they had no idea what Alexander was like, or that he was absolutely a very rare military genius. He'd shown that at Chaeronea, and he got that 300 miles in 10 days. So he literally pulled up in less than 2 weeks out in front of their walls. And then they didn't know what he would do, and he started to build siege engines right that day to take the city. And they didn't understand that his army, they thought they were going to go outside the walls and fight a conventional battle. They had done that at Chaeronea, and they didn't realize that the Macedonian army was a revolutionary thing of terror. Its spears were not spears. They were sarissas. They were 18 feet long. Theirs were only 9. The first 5 rows of the phalanx could hit the enemy. The Greeks only the first 3. They had combined cavalry. They had light armed troops. They had missile troops. They were professionals. They weren't citizen soldiers. So they didn't know fully why Macedon was so powerful, and they didn't understand that Alexander had a grand vision of getting to Persia as quickly as possible and using Greek resources along with Macedonian. And in his way of thinking, I have to make an example out of this city so that when I'm gone, nobody will revolt in my rear. And all of that was not a mystery. There were people who knew that. And yet, when they tried to voice those opinions, they were shouted down or exiled or ridiculed. And the Spartans, they got to the isthmus and they said, no, we're not going to go any further. We understand that he's on his way. We understand, we know who he is, and we want no part of this revolt. And then all of a sudden, everybody said that. He said, we hear he's going to pull up any minute. He's not assassinated. He's not dead. He's capable. He's a madman, and he's going to destroy you, and we're not going to lift a finger to help you. And then they found themselves in a dilemma. At that point, they should have surrendered and saved the city. And he probably would. He offered them terms if they gave up the revolutionaries who had started the rebellion.
What did he do with the city and people after the battle in which he defeated them? So what makes this constitute an annihilation event?
Well, in very loud forms, he said he was a admirer of the poet Pindar, who had been dead for over 100 years. But so he said, I am going to save the house of Pindar, and I'm going to save religious officials. But in the actual battle that day, there were probably 4,000 or 5,000 Thebans that were killed during the siege. And we don't know exactly the population of ancient Thebes, but a good guess is somewhere between 15 and 20,000. So women and children were enslaved. That children usually was somewhere between 16 and 14 would be survived. And all the males, and there may have been 10,000 of them who were not killed, were executed. And we don't know how many escaped. There's some in one of our sources that says some people rode off on horses and got to the Gulf. We don't know. But then he leveled the city. It had Mycenaean roots, so it was enormous. The city was destroyed in 335, but we know that there had been continuous habitation there since about 1600 BC, monumental civilization. And this was the home of all of the embryo of Greek mythology. So when you were an Athenian and you went to the tragic theater, the plays that you watched by Euripides or Aeschylus or Sophocles, the premier or the marquee plays were all about the House of Thebes. They were Antigone, they were Oedipus Rex, they were Oedipus at Colonus, they were the women of Trachis. That was the legendary plays. It was the Bacchae of Euripides. So nobody thought that this iconic city would be destroyed. It would be as almost if somebody destroyed New York, or maybe not New York because it's so big, but it was something that was a fixture of Hellenic civilization. And it had been in the 530s, 540s, 550s, 560s, for 50 years, it had taken over the leadership of Greece from Sparta and Athens under the legendary general Epaminondas. It was a Pythagorean, radical, democratic, very volatile, powerful force in Greek powers. It had almost united most of Greece. And they had new ways of fighting, and they were democratic zealots. And they had built huge cities in the Peloponnese, and people thought, whatever Thebes does will work, or we'll follow Thebes. But Thebes was no match for the Macedonian.
You said that Alexander wanted to create an example out of Thebes, and I understand from a pragmatic level, or on a pragmatic level, that he wanted vengeance, he wanted to preclude retaliation. Maybe he wanted to make money as he built this empire and to win allies. But what do you think was going on in his head from a moral perspective? Because as you mentioned, the Thebans thought he was an Aristotelian. And did he ever explain this in writings, or did he display regret for the violence on that day?
He supposedly did later. There were anecdotal passages, and I mean anecdotal in historians that are not otherwise concerned with Thebes, that while on his 10-year crusade that destroyed the Persian Empire, when he encountered people from Thebes or Boeotia, maybe they were in exile or a child that had grown up, he was deferential to them. And at one point he said he didn't mean to do it. And when the city was refounded by Cassander, one of his successors, who, when he died, of course, they had this 2 decades long war all over the ancient world to inherit the empire that he created. One of the factions was an anti-Alexander faction, said, okay, you guys, Antipater or Antigonus, you may be the true heir of Alexander, but what Alexander did was wrong, and I'm going to represent Greece, and I'm going to refound Thebes and rectify the damage that Alexander did to the Greek people as a propaganda tool to unify Greeks under his dictatorship. So, but the point is, there was a lot of people who hadn't seen anything like it quite. In the Peloponnesian War, there had been 2 tiny little towns, or maybe 3, Scione, Torone, Milos. But not when Athens lost the war, there was a debate about what to do with it. And actually, the Thebans wanted to destroy it. And that was just considered an anathema. And they didn't destroy it. And Greeks typically didn't do that. And, Romans typically didn't do that either. But after the destruction of Carthage, they did. That same year, they destroyed the Greek city of Corinth. And so this is going to inaugurate a new page that the absolute destruction of a civilization is considered permissible. And I accentuate throughout the book, it's very rare. I mean, people have said to me, well, we annihilated the Japanese. No, we didn't. They had a population of 75 million people. They lost 2.5 million people in that war. In fact, the Japanese army killed more people in terms of how many, in the ratio of how many they lost, than any other army or military in World War II. They killed over 15 million Chinese, probably 4 million Asians, probably 800,000 Westerners, and they lost about 2.5 million civilian and military people. And Japan, of course, recovered very quickly, was rebuilt under different auspices. Same with Germany. But we haven't seen that much. But we have weapons. It's hard to. People think that the moral sense has evolved more quickly than technology has, and that's one of the themes in the book, that it not only hasn't, but it might have regressed. And it's much easier to wipe out I think people think with globalization you can't wipe out a society, but a lot of people think you can. Mr. Erdogan has told the Greeks that one morning they're going to wake up and they're going to look at a sea of missiles in the sky coming from Turkey. And he said the Armenians will be dealt with in the same fashion that our 19th century ancestors dealt with them. And of course, these things happen when there's a limited population. This isn't the Carthaginian Empire or the First Punic War of 20 million people. You're down to 500,000 people. And the same thing with Byzantium and Thebes. And so there's only 2.5 million Armenians in the world today. And they're all concentrated. The people who actually speak Armenian, the Armenian Orthodox, except for a small diaspora, they're all in Armenia, landlocked and dependent, on ports and fuel and resources on Russia for the most part. And they're very vulnerable. So are the Kurds, so are the Greeks. Greeks, I think, are especially vulnerable given what Turkey's been doing, not to mention Israel.